So, welcome again. My name is Renaud-Philippe Garner. I'm a professor, assistant professor at the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus here in the Department of Economics, Philosophy, and Political Science. And today my guest is Adam Jones. He's a full professor here at the Department of Economics, Philosophy, and Political Science. And Adam completed his doctoral studies at the University of British Columbia. He then did a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale. And as far as I can tell, he's never really left UBC after that. Which has made for an immense amount of stability, certainly a lot more than many academics when you read their CVs. And Adam Jones, the reason why he's with us today is because he's incontestably an expert on genocide and even gender-based violence. Perhaps the best way of illustrating this is with a single but powerful claim, which is that his Genocide, a comprehensive introduction, published by Routledge, and now on, if I'm not mistaken, its 4th edition, is the most widely used textbook on the topic. Need I say more? So, Adam, it's a pleasure to have you as a colleague, and it's a pleasure to speak with you tonight.
Likewise, sir, a pleasure to have you as a colleague, and really a pleasure to be at this university. You mentioned my long tenure here, and I've really never felt the impetus to move on. I came here straight from Yale University, and all in all, found this a more stimulating environment and enjoy participating in bringing some of these subjects and programs and concerns to the Okanagan and to the university. When they hired me, they said one of the most beautiful things that has ever been said to me in academia, which is, tell us what you want to teach and we'll get it in the calendar. Because they were at the time anxious to boost and expand their course offerings. They hired me, I think, in part because I'm a globalist and could teach in a number of different subject areas. I don't want to be doing genocide and crimes against humanity all the time. I think it would be a bit taxing. So that has afforded me opportunities, I think, at a smaller and newer campus that certainly as a new hire, I would not have enjoyed at a larger institution. And I've appreciated that scale ever since, and the opportunity to really get to know students and follow them over the course of their program and so on.
I think you're quite right. I think anyone in academia who hears those words, what do you want to teach? We'll give it to you. Sounds almost too good to be true. So I'm
It
I'm
does,
glad they
doesn't it?
did give it to you.
Yeah.
And I know from my students that you don't just teach genocide. But we are going to talk about genocide in part because this video is part of a kind of PPE Conversations, really for the classroom. And so we're going to talk to you because we're giving this class on just war theory or the ethics of war and peace. And, genocide obviously has a relationship to that. There need not be an international war for there to be a genocide, but there are strong relationships. So I think, particularly given the current political context, it might help to say, look, we hear the word genocide a lot. You're a well-read man. You've certainly read Orwell, where he pointed out that the word fascist was used willy-nilly to mean almost anything. And I
Yeah.
suspect that some people might feel like, well, I'm not sure I know what it means anymore. It seems like it's just something bad is happening. There's a genocide, right? That's just what it means.
Yeah.
I suspect other people would, really feel like their hackles are raising when they hear that. And they're like, no, not anything is a genocide. Words have meaning. So maybe we could start off there. Has genocide gone the way of fascism? It just means I'm angry or I don't like you. What are we to do with this, Adam?
Yeah, boy, so many different angles into that question. I think you're right, first of all, that it's hard for me to think of a time during my engagement with this subject that it has been so prominent in public discourse and global discourse, particularly around the Israel-Gaza question. The power of the word, and remember that this is an invented word, a neologism created by a Polish Jewish lawyer and scholar named Raphael Lemkin in the 1940s. He was a refugee from the Nazis. Most of his family died in the Holocaust. And actually, long before the Holocaust, in his childhood, he had become very preoccupied with the stories that he read and heard about principally religious and ethnic minorities around the world and throughout history being destroyed. And moreover, that at least in the modern era, was being done under the aegis of state sovereignty, meaning if we're doing it to our own citizens, outside actors have no right to intervene. And indeed, it is a violation of the code of state sovereignty for them to do so. And Lemkin wrestled with that conundrum in the wake of the First World War and terminology for the crime that he wanted to name. He wanted to ensure that it would be the foundation for criminal legislation. He believed that that was in some ways the likeliest cure for the condition. I'm not sure we're quite as idealistic about that today, in the wake of 20 or 30 years of implementing the Genocide Convention. But he was strict about that. In his initial presentation of the concept in a book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe in 1944. I have an original copy of it sitting over my shoulder. In coining the word genocide, he placed it explicitly in the context of Nazi pseudo-legal legislation in the occupied territories, which, as he saw it, was in fact designed to implement genocide as he saw it. Now, Lemkin's definition, if you go back to it, is quite strikingly different from that of the Genocide Convention just 4 years later in 1948. And since that time, if you consult the first chapter of my textbook, you'll find around 4 pages of it taken up with proposed alternative definitions and understandings of genocide. What we clearly have here is what we call in the social sciences an essentially contested concept. There is no stable consensus as to what it precisely means. The closest thing we have to that is the legislation embodied in the Genocide Convention, but it's quite ambiguous in places. It is still being worked out in case law. There is not a lot of case law around genocide, even these days, because it's a difficult crime to prove. Under the Genocide Convention, you have to show a specific intent to destroy members of one of the 4 protected groups, ethnic, national, racial, and religious groups, in whole or in part. Whereas by contrast, if you make a horizontal shift as a prosecutor to a linked but distinct body of international legislation that actually reached maturity around the time that the genocide concept was being introduced in the 1940s. I'm speaking about crimes against humanity. And if you look at the actual prosecutions for atrocity crimes in recent years and decades, the vast majority of those prosecutions will be either for war crimes or for crimes against humanity. And the evidentiary bar and the continued kind of definitional controversies around genocide has made it a challenging instrument to introduce in a courtroom. And my sense is that it would be unlikely to be preferred to crimes against humanity or to accompany crimes against humanity unless there was very clear evidence of ethnically based or religiously based systematic mass killing on a substantial scale. We've seen perhaps Omar al-Bashir in Sudan cross that with his indictment for genocide, at least, but
Mhm.
there has not been an indictment for genocide since. To my knowledge, and that was a long time ago.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, cases do continue to unfold in various venues around crimes against humanity. So, last comment I would make about that is because we have this contested concept, we even have quite a few people in the field today going back to Raphael Lemkin's original formulations, particularly because they are seen to be um, very harmonious with the concerns and experiences of indigenous peoples worldwide. Lemkin has a very cultural and sociological understanding of genocide as a kind of multifaceted assault on every aspect of a targeted group's existence and cohesion and culture and language and dignity. That's a word that actually comes into his definition. Um, and that, I think, is something that resonates very deeply with Indigenous peoples. And I've seen it cited, for example, in the National Report on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, where they were explicitly preferring the Lemkian understanding of genocide. So we're still hashing it out. I think we'd better accept that it's going to be essentially contested forever. I think we should seize some of the advantages of that, which is that it at least does remain a subject of live contestation and constant re-examination and reconfiguration. That's positive. It's not a stale or cliched concept, I think. Um, and the other aspect of it that I think we better get used to is the fact that it is likely to be more prominent and more impactful as both a kind of intellectual and scholarly heuristic on the one hand, a kind of lens on history and on current affairs on the one hand, and on the other hand, a political tool and an advocacy strategy to draw attention to humanitarian concerns that might not otherwise receive it. And that, of course, raises the danger of the term being over applied or being casually applied in order just to, press a button. We have seen some of that without question. But I think there have also been numerous cases in which that language has been effectively and appropriately used, maybe contestably used, but appropriately, to stress the severity and urgency of a particular humanitarian crisis and to demand action and maybe intervention. And I know those interventions are something that you want to touch upon in this
Oh,
conversation as
yes,
well.
we will. um, so I appreciate that, and I think it's helpful for students, young and young at heart, to learn that there are concepts that are deeply contested, that there sometimes isn't wide-scale agreement. So one concept, which I don't think is antiquated or fossilized, is, first-degree murder. In many states, there's a ranking of murders, and lawyers and judges can clearly agree that there's a certain kind of murder which is different from manslaughter, and it requires planning, and it's the
Yes.
worst charge of murder. So we can have large agreement and other things, official charges of things like high treason in a state or things like that. But then we've got these concepts where, well, we kind of think we know what we're talking about. The moment we try to pin them down, You've got objections left, right, up, down, center.
Yeah.
And I guess one thing, maybe just to finish on this, I want to maybe just prod you a little bit before moving on, is so genocide, as you said, is a neologism that emerges in the 20th century. The phenomena doesn't, but the words do. So we plausibly could argue there are plenty of genocides historically. We had no words for them. And then, I think in the wake of during the First World War, I thought some American official called it race murder when they were killing the Armenians.
Yes, and the German for genocide, Völkermorde, forgive me if my pronunciation is wrong, is very similarly
Right.
derived, and there are
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
cases of that.
Right. So then we say, but there are other neologisms that emerged in the 20th century. And if we're trying to say something like, well, is it genocide? One question we can ask is, well, is it better captured by these other terms like crimes against humanity or ethnic cleansing? And then you say, well, doesn't it allow us to hem things in a little? I mean, classic war crimes is just the violation of jus in bello. Don't directly target civilians, don't use prohibited weapons, don't fake surrender. There's a list, but these are rules
Yes,
combatants are supposed to respect to fight well or honorably. But then you think, well, ethnic cleansing has to do with ethnicity or groups, and so does genocide, but aren't there differences? And I always understood it that ethnic cleansing has a strangely territorially bounded objective. You could say, look, as long as you all leave the province, we'll stop slaughtering
yeah,
you. We won't chase you to the moon or to the whatever the giant trench is in
correct.
the ocean. I don't recall the name right now. We're not going to take submarines and chase you down the ocean. It's not Aquaman.
Right.
So you might say, okay, so there are already things we can say, try to push back and say, well, not everything is, genocide,
For
and
sure.
maybe sometimes we really want to focus on some of these other neologisms.
No question. One doesn't necessarily avoid the complexities and ambiguities by turning to the other neologisms with ethnic cleansing, for example, which is a contentious term in its way because it is essentially viewing the phenomenon through the eyes of the perpetrators, that a territory is cleansed by their actions. And that is indeed the origins of it from the Serbian, that is to say, as a program initiated by the perpetrators. And when you actually, of course, look at ethnic cleansings, so-called, the crime against humanity is forcible transfer of populations, which is more or less the same thing, just doesn't require an explicitly ethnic component. When you actually look at recent cases thereof, it would be unusual, although not impossible, to find cases where people are basically told, okay, get out and you will be otherwise unmolested. Standardly, they are terrorized into getting out, and there are selective atrocities inflicted on the menfolk of the community or sexual violence against the womenfolk, other things that establish a climate of terror and spur people to flee. And when you're talking about selective murder and you're talking about terroristic sexual violence, you're moving very much into the terrain of genocide, even under the fairly restrictive convention definition. The convention, remember, says in whole or in part, and it doesn't specify how substantial the part of a group targeted needs to be. It does have that rather limited list of protected groups. So you would have to show that the targeted population belongs to one of them, or that the perpetrator believed that they did. So anyway, there are gray areas and there are spillovers, and none more so than when it comes down to the linkages between war and genocide. In chapter 2 of my textbook, uh, address what I call the four horsemen of the genocidal apocalypse. I'm not always prone to melodramatic language, but I figured I could get away with it. And in other words, the historical cofactors of genocide and the institutions that, while not necessarily genocidal in themselves, have objectively blended with genocide, being the contexts for genocide, etc. And those are state building, imperialism and colonialism kind of collapse together, social revolutions of the most dramatic and usually violent variety, and last and certainly not least, war. And the if those are the four horsemen, I've argued that war and genocide are the conjoined twins, that they can be very difficult to separate. It can, one of the challenges that I present to my students every time I teach my intro course is let's try to distinguish just war or, just war and genocide. And the further you get into the quagmire, the more difficult it can be. Some people have said, for example, that the difference between war and genocide is that in war, the killing stops when the other side surrenders. And in genocide, there is no possibility of surrender. Surrender will not be accepted and it will not
Yeah.
stop the violence,
Yeah.
right?
No quarter will be given. Yeah.
Yeah. But that suggests, as a student pointed out to me a little disconcertingly after a recent class, he said, "Hey, didn't you say that actually under genocide law, motive doesn't matter?" And that's true. If you look at the language of the Genocide Convention, it does require specific intent, but it says nothing about motive per se. And there may or may not be congruence with the two. You, for example, could be seeking to loot an indigenous territory, and an indigenous population is in your way or is available to be slave labored to death, let's say, and you do it. And to my mind, and I think most scholars' minds, that would be genocidal, intentional, group targeted, even if the motive was simply looting and rapine.
Mhm.
And that I think is an important point to keep in mind. And this student called me on it and said, so following that thought through, if you destroy members of a group in order to bring about their surrender, and they do surrender, that doesn't excuse you from the intentional genocide accusation just because their surrender was your motive. And I had to concede the point. And one last thing about that, because you mentioned this question of homicide and how traditionally in domestic societies, we have gradations of that and we have variations of that. Yes?
Mhm.
One way we conceptualize it is first degree, second degree, third degree, and maybe fourth degree. That's very common in legal systems. A controversial but I think very good genocide scholar and scholar of indigenous peoples' genocides named Ward Churchill, in an ironically titled book called A Little Matter of Genocide, subtitled Holocaust and Denial in the Americas, 1492 to the Present. He was looking very much at indigenous people's experiences in the Americas as a kind of continuous process of genocide as opposed to a discrete event, which I think is another reconfiguration that's going on in the field right now, moving a bit away from this event-based and emergency-based focus. But Churchill's proposal was to organize genocide in the same way, in the first degree, second degree, third degree, and fourth degree, based upon issues like documentable intent, distance and indirectness of the killing involved, and so on. And I think that kind of nuance, conceptually at least, is perhaps helpful. Um, One other example of this that is always problematic ethically and conceptually for myself and for students is when we get what Nicholas Robbins and I have labeled subaltern genocides, genocides by the oppressed. So, what happens when, let's say, the enslaved African population of Haiti in the late 18th century rises up against its white masters and tormentors, and I think you could say genociders, and adopts genocidal strategies against them? Murder all the whites, expel all the whites, right? Line that up against the language of the Genocide Convention, and it fits. Nonetheless, most of us, I think, would wrestle with our empathy with that population and the enormous pressures that it was under and the last resortedness of the violence that was adopted. And we would be inclined to cut them slack, that we would not cut simple race murderers, if you know what I mean. I don't know what your thoughts
Yeah,
are
no,
on that.
I'm not sure I'm entirely on the side of once a victim, now subject to softer justice. I don't find anything
Well, not
shocking.
about past atrocities, not like they hammered us in the past, so now we have a right to hammer them now. But in order to stop a genocidal enslavement process that is ongoing,
Yeah.
arguably, genocide in self-defense, is there such a thing?
Probably not, because I mean, if we're talking about a place like Haiti, um, there might be a population that benefits from the enslavement, but the reality is enslavement requires an enforcement mechanism. The reality is most, or a great deal of them, are just not. I mean, the small children and women or the old men are not really part of keeping people in chains. So if what you need to defeat is the core sort of instrument, then you just those excess deaths are hard to justify. They're not, it's not discriminate.
Certainly.
So I mean, I think some people would try to say, yes, we have to understand them. I would just say, well, fine, but like everyone who commits a war crime thinks they have a reason. Like, surprise,
Okay.
surprise. Few
Okay.
people see
So
themselves as
would
a
it
villain.
would it be
Um,
acceptable under those circumstances for the slaves to rise up and say, we are going, kill every French adult male,
Adult
for
male, you're already
example?
getting closer to being discriminate, but not everyone who's a male is involved in war making,
Right.
right? If you think that, so I'm not sure that I don't find the kind of you behave terribly, we get to behave terribly. I don't think it's a great standard. Essentially, what it means is um, well, as long as the other guy started, we don't have to be held to serious moral
Yeah.
standards. And unfortunately,
Yeah.
given the tragedy of human history, that seems like a very quick recipe to just have a race to the bottom. So
Absolutely.
and I also think people
As
who,
we saw during World War II with the
yes,
area
yeah,
bombing and
yes,
atomic
exactly,
bombing, for
exactly,
example. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. The often underappreciated. And I also think I would just point out in this case that people are actually quite selectively squeamish, and I suspect you probably have noticed this too. If we talk about genocide, they really have in their minds the images they have are probably a lot of male-on-male violence. I mean, if you say, wait a second, if you can really just
Mhm.
exterminate people and it's genocide, how much raping do we get to do? I'm not so sure the people who were a minute ago thinking, well, we have to understand the poor Haitians. If we say, yeah, but now if it's about extermination and it's all the whites and that includes women,
Yeah.
rape then murder is part of what you've allowed. How keen are you on that? And I suspect some people who a minute ago thought it's just, a worse version of MMA, would all of a sudden start to shift in their chairs and say, well, I'm not sure I justified that. So,
Right.
so, so I
Well,
do wonder.
yeah, that's very useful points there. The whole gender aspect of this, I think, is really notable in terms of whom we accord our sympathies to. and whom we attend to in a humanitarian sense, I would argue that the humanitarian plight, including the specific vulnerabilities to genocidal violence and sexual violence, has been a hallmark of humanitarian discourse and advocacy since the mid-19th century. And if you follow that through the Bulgarian atrocities of the 1870s, if you follow it through the Armenian genocide, if you follow it through to Bangladesh and Kosovo, and to much of the reporting from trouble spots around the world today, it is extremely common to see the highlighting of victimization of groups considered traditionally vulnerable and civilian in nature, and precious little, if any, attention paid to the
Military
gender
betrayal.
selective targeting of military age males or younger boys or older men on gender grounds. That element of the humanitarian discourse is something that I tried to spark a quarter of a century ago or so, and I think I've had some success in doing so, but the broad trend is still pretty evident to me. So I think that there are concerns expressed about that, but I think that there has always been a certain understanding that when the killing extends beyond adult men, men of a so-called fighting age, who are therefore kind of militarized en bloc, are only those populations that stand outside that group are accorded civilian status. And we've really seen the devastating consequences of that at times, as with Srebrenica in 1995, for example, and just an obliviousness on part of the United Nations as to what the Bosnian men were facing in those circumstances.
Yeah, I think you're quite right that this when we talk about destroying a group in part or in whole, even if you're trying to do all of it, there is this at the very least prioritization sometimes in terms of who we're selecting as victims, but also who we're putting forward as images, even when it's a conventional war with no necessary genocidal aspect. You know, the rape of Belgium by the Germans in 1914 is always Belgium embodied as a woman who's in distress, and the mean, vicious Huns, you know, lurching over her.
Absolutely.
This is an old trope. Or the first Iraq War.
Ravished Armenia from the Armenian genocide.
Exactly. Right? Or the as you well know, the false testimony of the was it young Kuwaiti girl before American Congress that helped spur the first Gulf War, where the made up stories about babies in incubators and things like that. So yes, atrocity propaganda is a very old trick, and it doesn't put every victim equally forward. This is certainly true.
May I just mention in that context, I think the Israel-Gaza case offers us a real-time kind of case study.
Sure.
Because the construction of civilians as measured by non-males among the casualty count and the controversies over that, but more generally the notion that if you are a man of a certain age in Gaza, you're fair game, and no one is really going to get very exercised in a humanitarian sense about it, even if they don't declare you to be a murdered terrorist militant. There will be that kind of tacit assumption. Or anyway,
or skepticism,
tendency.
something like that. So I think you're right. And I think it's played strangely by both sides, if I may. Because Hamas, why people think Hamas's numbers are accurate, I don't know. They tell us the Russian Ministry of Defense can't be trusted in Ukraine, but some people will blindly believe Hamas's numbers. Hamas strangely provides like incredibly consistent numbers, and you wonder, like, there's a kind of statistical miracle going on, like the exact percentage of children and every time something gets bombed. And so in a way they're encouraging it by saying, well, they really want to put their women and children front and center, and so themselves are endorsing the idea that, like, well, we don't care about Ahmed, he's 18. And in the same way, the Israelis, putting forward, in some ways, I suppose, attacking Western hypocrisy or the hypocrisy of some Western feminists, saying, well, if you're such big feminists and people are openly exhibiting rape as which is a war crime, if they're openly celebrating it, where's your outrage? So they're saying that, oh, we have murdering that 33-year-old man who was a farmer was also a war crime, but we're like,
Sure.
nah. Let's go with so I think you're
Sure.
right that both sides are playing up this, and in a way they're both just hammering down on these norms.
Yes.
And in a way, yeah, and anyone who's a 30-year-old man who's more or less connected to the war might not in a way be even war making or carrying a weapon, is just like you're at the back of the line in terms of symbolic priority. So I think
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. I
So
think there's been I think there's been a bit of positive movement in the last 2 or 3 decades since I've been engaged with that issue. I think international organizations and human rights actors are somewhat more sensitive to the fact that gender doesn't run in all one direction.
no, that's it.
One quick comment about the Gaza case is that you may well be right to call into to question the figures that Hamas is providing. Um, there is also the possibility to call them into question as an underestimate. And that has been done by a couple of
Oh,
quite serious voices in recent months. And I would add my suspicion that the death toll is, in fact, much higher than that and probably well into six figures by now. But we'll come back to that when the
yeah.
evidence is clearer.
Yeah, okay, so I think the last part that what you're saying is incredibly important. You certainly remember the Lancet scandal about the really bad data around Iraq a few years ago, the numbers that were, roundly criticized about wildly overestimating civilian deaths in Iraq. It's not every day the Lancet gets that much in hot water, but it did. So I don't have any doubts that maybe absolute numbers are wrong, but percentages are striking to me when you get these like neatly repeatedly distributed, and you're like any conflict that's less ideologically charged. When I read about Prussian numbers of the 18th century, it's funny how much they vary from battle to battle or
Yeah.
event to event. So when people provide you these amazing percentages that never vary or things like that, they're so neat that I have doubts about. But underestimating dead and wounded, or also things deferred in time, right? People who are wounded who die later on, things like that.
Or people
Um,
buried under the rubble.
Right. And difficulty, identifying some of these things, totally, ruined remains. We're not sure how many people are actually in this pile or whatever. So yeah, I think we should be careful to realize that we almost always learn more as more is excavated and we do the archival work and the registration and whatever. Um,
Correct.
those initial numbers are almost never entirely accurate unless you have some, clear military roster. There's 830 men. How many can I count now?
Yeah.
But even those things can, see corrections and whatever. So I agree with that we shouldn't be too hasty to be too confident. But I want to talk a bit about intervention, because one thing you mentioned earlier, which I thought was very interesting and telling, was about the indictment of Omar Bashir. What a name we haven't heard in a little while. Out
Yeah.
of all the monsters in the world, we haven't heard the Bashir name in a little while. And you might think, isn't that in a way an illustration of what happens? So you presented, I think, a relatively optimistic view. I'm going to play the cynic tonight. And we might say, look, there are a lot of talk about genocide, a lot of talk about crimes. You're well aware one of these courts is nicknamed the International Court for Africans. We don't try half the
Right.
amount of people we should be trying. We only catch the small, there's a famous quote about the law. It's like a spider web. It's strong enough to catch the weak, too weak to catch the strong. And you might say, do we ever really prevent or punish as the convention requires? Of all the possible cases, all the opportunities to prevent and punish, I'm not sure our track record is astounding. And we might start
Yeah.
becoming cynical about that and say, is it really just rhetoric? Because we never really intend to follow up.
Yeah. Well, do we ever, and what is our track record, are slightly different questions.
Yes.
And again, there's a lot of different angles into this. One of the things that lingers from our last exchange, you mentioned the way that actors will jump in with self-interested presentations of the facts, and one needs to be very skeptical and to sift them very carefully. Actors will also jump in very readily with claims of genocide. That has been notable from day one following October 7th. Well, for some of us, it was notable on October 7th as well, because I've called that a genocidal massacre. Whatever I have to say about the subsequent Israeli attack on Gaza. So that is a hindrance in a sense that advocates of particular causes will tend to leap to that framework, and that also has to be analyzed and sifted. You make the point about the selectivity of the legal process. That we have a world in which impunity for the great powers is almost total, and where it's very, very difficult to imagine a US president or a Chinese leader or a Russian president standing trial before the International Criminal Court in the absence of some kind of, overthrow and seizure of same, these, particularly in Russia, you could never rule that out, I suppose. But not only do there seem to be certain actors who are just off limits, but the cost and logistical challenges of trying even a lower level actor is so intense that one has to perhaps seek the primary benefit slightly outside the field of justice. Let me give you one historical example of that, and one that's still often debated for its worth, and that is the Nuremberg trials. Obviously, victor's justice on some level, obviously highly selective. They actually chose not to try more leaders than could be seated in the courtroom. So that was their standard for how many of the Nazi perpetrators were going to face that kind of justice. Clearly, some deeply evil people were eliminated as a result of that. I'm not personally in favor of the death penalty, but some kind of justice was brought. And however, in retrospect, it's probably more important as an iconic historical event than, or at least equally important, for example, for the documentary evidentiary record that it turned up with regard to the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. And that documentary record still forms much of the basis for research on and understanding of those crimes, and the best available counter to those who would deny them. So justice pursued can have those kind of long-term positive effects, even when it is selective, even when it is victor's justice, at least to some degree. Last point I would mention on that is, and something that I pay quite a lot of attention to in the Justice, Truth, and Redress chapter of my textbook, is some of those more quasi-judicial and popular-based initiatives. I'm thinking of things like the people's tribunals, which have been held to drag various underexposed crimes into the light. And it's usually been done by the political left. It's usually been done selectively by the political left. But it has also been a means to get some of that documentation and testimony on the record about, for example, genocide in Central America, when the US was running that show, and that was a very taboo subject to raise and to investigate and to denounce. So
Mhm.
there are certain supplementary or quasi institutions that can, I think, contribute to justice broadly viewed, while avoiding some of the pitfalls, not all of them by any means, of the more um, formal and vastly more expensive processes.
So I think there's a lot in what you've said, and I think it's very rich and interesting for those who are to listen. So I agree that even selective things are can have benefits. I don't mean to be that cynical. After all, the police do not stop everyone from speeding. They stop some people who are speeding, and that doesn't mean we should stop therefore. It's not no one or everyone, it's a selection. But I think
Right.
there's actually something there that's actually, in a way, the most tragic thing you said is even some of these smaller trials, if we think about trying people in the Balkans as opposed to trying to try people for the entire war, two wars in Chechnya, probably a far bigger task. Or if we try to try people in China for what they're doing to the Uyghurs, I suspect that's a bigger operation.
Right.
So you're pointing out that, okay, these trials have value, even these smaller ones or Nuremberg. And I agree that part of the great thing that is worth pointing out is that they didn't deny that it happened. They tried to find other ways around it. But like they're like, yes, yes, we had the chambers, and yes, yes, we had the trains. And Eichmann was quite clear about what he was doing, though he wasn't at Nuremberg, but Eichmann is a related figure. There was a point of having this
Yeah.
trial. But by emphasizing the cost of trials, and trials are cheap compared to war, in a way, what you're
Yeah.
revealing is the tragic aspect is that we should expect very little intervention because of how expensive in blood and treasure war
Okay.
actually
Good
is.
point. Good point. Let me come to the question of what a lot of people understand by intervention, which is the political and military style intervention. Just before I do, one point that I think could be cited as another potential contribution of those formal legal processes, regardless of how restricted or selective they are, is that they have begun to hone some key areas of humanitarian law, including genocide law. Um, Two examples of that from the same body, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the
Okay.
ad hoc tribunal established after the Rwandan genocide. It issued a very influential ruling, because it was asked to clarify what were the objective ethnic differences between Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda? To what extent could the Tutsi victimized be considered members of an ethnic group distinct from Hutu when they spoke the same language, followed the same religion, had a common history, had high levels of intermarriage between them, and so on? And the ruling was to the effect that what was important was neither the objective ethnic characteristics of the group, nor the ethnic identity proclaimed by the group, but the ethnic collective identity imposed upon the targeted victims. Okay. Another example that's been cited of that is, how do we count the Jews who converted to Christianity and then were murdered in the Holocaust when they no longer considered themselves Jews? They would be counted as victims of the Holocaust because the Nazis considered them Jews and because the Nazis killed them as Jews. And the ICTR ruled accordingly, and I thought that is not only a significant judgment, but actually part of my own preferred definition of genocide as well, that the definition of the group is according to the perpetrator's definition, not some kind of outside or abstract definition. The other example is with regard to sexual violence, which was almost unprecedented in the Rwandan genocide on its scale and savagery, and the ruling by the ICTR that rape under certain circumstances when committed as part of a campaign to destroy a group in whole or in part, met the provisions of Article 2B of the Genocide Convention for severe bodily and mental harm, and therefore could be considered genocidal in and of itself. And that, somewhat controversial, still being discussed, but certainly also an eye-opener and one that's been very influential in international humanitarian law since then. Now, about the military and political interventions, the track record is not great. At least if one is looking for successful interventions that are driven by ethical imperatives as pure as driven snow. That's not the world we live in. I think there are cases that you can isolate where interventions, including successful interventions, with a military component or a military focus, have been mounted with significantly or predominantly ethical concerns behind them. I would mention cases like the Kurds in northern Iraq and the no-fly zone that was established under Saddam Hussein. I think Kosovo might pass that test. And I'm quite sure that East Timor later in 1999 may be, for me, the kind of paragon modern intervention, although very few people today remember it or know anything about it. It's extremely interesting. It was successful, quite dramatically so, I believe, after a couple of very scary false starts. But it suggested the ability to recover from those false starts, suggested a measure of institutional learning was taking place, which was also good to see. Against that, we have to set, I don't know, Russia listing its invasion of Ukraine as a humanitarian intervention. Any predatory power will seek to cloak its aggression in humanitarian guise. Putin even presents it as a genocide prevention project, you know? And obviously
He
that kind of
deserves points for originality.
he is creative, I will grant him that.
But you well know that
And
empire has long stressed it's doing it for the benefit of those it invades. Empire cannot claim it's acting on the basis of self-determination, so it trades that for a basket of goodies. We bring you enlightenment, freedom, civilization, advancement. So look, you're not wrong. There's a non-zero amount of interventions. I agree. But you might worry about the sparseness of them. You might worry about they seem to be targeting particularly weak adversaries or actors.
That's a
Now,
fair point.
someone like
Although East Timor and Indonesia is a very interesting case because it's counterintuitive in terms of who the great powers ended up siding with. The other thing, and I think we need to supplement this because I said we shouldn't necessarily expect pure motives.
No, of course.
And it would probably be remiss of us to do so if intervention is possible with hands that are not entirely clean. One of the critiques that's often been mounted from the left is that all of these humanitarian interventions are just a guise for seizure of the natural resources and economic opportunities of less developed countries and to get them in the hands of Western multinational corporations. Occasionally, or maybe more than occasionally, Chile, 1973, not really a humanitarian rhetoric around that, but certainly Iraq, where you send in the forces and the only edifice that is occupied is the oil ministry, that probably tells you something about the underlying motives. So there are cases, I think, of just flat out gangsterism, and I think Iraq is a pretty good case of that, although the regime in question was about as grotesque as any in the world.
Yeah,
Um,
you don't need to be
how,
a
but
friend of Hussein to to point
no,
out
no.
some of the self-servingness. But I guess sorry,
Sorry, just one
sure, of
last point
course.
to get a couple of things on the table here. There is a whole set of interventions that could be judged as successful, even dramatically successful, at a military level, but which clearly had an element of self-interest involved. To a certain extent, we even encourage that, don't we, when we say it's better if regional actors should intervene rather than very distant ones. There's an implication that those that are closer have a greater interest in that, and that their interest is not necessarily a bad thing. Um, and indeed, it can be appealed to in trying to get them to act. Classic examples of that would be, you could probably argue that the intervention against the Nazis counted on some level. Um, India in East Pakistan in
Yeah, that's the case I wanted to bring
1971.
you to. Um,
Vietnam in Cambodia
Cambodia.
in 1978, 1979. Um, Britain in Sierra Leone, maybe.
Yeah.
You could sort of say, okay, it was Britain posturing as still a world power, but it worked. And I don't think it was done in a brutal or indiscriminate way.
No,
So,
no,
yeah,
that
no,
was one of
just in
my.
other words, there is, I think, an additional set of cases that I frankly would have supported at the time, even though there was an evident element of self-interest involved.
No, I'm glad you got there because that's where I wanted to take us is, someone like Walzer argues that um, not just local actors, but usually actors who are not just geographically close, but usually culturally and religiously close, they're seen as less of an invader. And I think the case of actually India intervening in what was then East Pakistan, today Bangladesh, being slaughtered by what we call the Pakistanis today. Um, my reading of it is that the Indian government really didn't want to go. It was only when they realized they had a catastrophe on their doorstep that they went in.
Yeah,
So it seems like if we're going to talk about mixed motives, it was really self-interest, and they just flew the banner of intervention to make it seem a little less selfish. And I don't deny that because that was a successful intervention. And I think the Vietnamese in Cambodia, the end of the Khmer Rouge is a pretty good thing. You don't have to like
yeah,
communist Vietnam to think that's a success by anyone's book. But Walzer has this like short list, very much the list you're naming. But then very quickly what we realize is, okay, if those are the conditions for success, and not many people pat them on the back for this. Sometimes these were very
yeah.
controversial at the time, as you well know. Some people got really angry about these interventions at the time. We only pat them on the back
Oh
now.
gosh, yes.
So I wonder, if again, there just seems like we're really just pointing out features that make it very dark because we say, who's the local actor who's going to step into Sudan, right? In a way,
Yeah,
Bangladesh is just lucky to have India on the doorstep. If all you've got
yeah.
is, I don't know, Moldova or Paraguay, you better pray to God. You better hope there's a
Or
divine.
Ethiopia, which has its own
Exactly.
problems, or what,
Right,
you
right.
know.
If Ethiopia can
One
stop fighting
obviously
Eritrea
is,
long enough to intervene.
yeah, one obviously is looking for the African Union to take a lead, but as you rightly point out, how many of them have an interest in doing so? We are always going to run up against those loggerheads, and I think you've mentioned what is probably the most urgent humanitarian crisis in the world today, and very much a replay of the genocide of the early 2000s, and where our attention is elsewhere at present. Um, this is these are challenges that are not going to go away, but I don't think we can remove the challenge by simply saying a pox or on all your houses. I think we have to be selective and analytical and make um, real-time judgments, recognizing that we do so on the basis of incomplete information, but that it would be ethically irresponsible to withhold judgment or action or intervention if necessary. Um,
So I don't want to say
There
approx in
are
all your houses.
no, there are,
Um,
you know, in another present case that we maybe don't think about so much in the intervention landscape as such is Ukraine. And
mhm.
I think military intervention that fortifies a population trying to resist a criminal aggression is potentially at least a pretty positive intervention. And in fact, in the present case, I'd like to see more of it, even though I'm well aware that probably 95 cents in every dollar would come either from the United States with its own lamentable track record or from Western European countries with their own lamentable track records. Um, there does not seem to be any other easily available source
Yeah.
of necessary resources to bring about that just result. And therefore, I will not only accept but encourage actors with much less than clean hands to step up to the plate.
Yes, so I think Walzer puts it, quite pointedly. I think he says something like, the victims of these crimes pray for mixed motives because that's all that will save them. And I think something like that is true. So I think that
Yeah,
we shouldn't be too picky. But where I am worried is not so much mixed motives. The mixed motives doesn't bother me. I think we should be less angelic and ridiculous. We might get some results, but we are hostage to the need to have someone who's both motivated and powerful enough to do it. And many places don't have those neighbors, as we just alluded to. But also, and maybe we could maybe end with this. Here's a worry I have, and I think in a way it might be a worry you share. On the one hand, we don't want to say something like, look, we don't intervene a lot, so let's just give up. Let's just decide that um, any intervention is not worth it. We have a very cynical take on the 90s and 2000s and the aughts, and we just say R2P is a giant catastrophe. And of course, for our listeners, R2P is the doctrine, the responsibility to protect, the idea that if and when a state or the responsible actor has basically failed, someone has to be the adult in the world stage and step in to save the population. So it's not just that you have the option, but you have a responsibility to intervene. So maybe not quite a duty, but stronger than a permission.
yeah.
Okay. Maybe I'm more on the cynical camp, but I don't want to say nothing because India did succeed in Bangladesh, as selfish as they were. But I might worry that it's like, wait a second, if on the one hand, we're already having a hard time getting the hard work done on real and pretty clear-cut cases, and now we've got this essentially contested concept that people throw around like a political slogan, and they'll just say anything to get attention headlines for the next 6 weeks until the next tragédie du jour diverts our
Yeah, for sure.
attention in our tweets and our Facebook statuses and whatever amazing Western signaling we can get. Isn't there a worry there where, essentially contested concepts, particularly one thing is sometimes they tend to creep, they tend to get bigger and more expensive. And then we might think that at some point it's just going to make the whole thing look even worse than it does. Even if we have a
Yeah.
narrow view and we look soberly at even the best successes, might we worry that like if we want more of the intervention, we should actually be a little less promiscuous with the language.
No question. And one way that we might avoid getting into all of the contested debates about genocide is to stop genocides before they happen, and then we won't have to debate them and whether they constitute this or that or at what point they cross the threshold. And I think that's an appropriate point to end on because we've kind of been discussing intervention from the firefighting model, right? Something erupts and we call somebody to put the fire out. One of the driving and animating questions of the genocide studies field, I would say, particularly in the contributions of political scientists and social psychologists, is what can we do to bolster the resilience of societies so that they do not fall prey to genocide or can withstand the predictable stressors that in other cases have brought about genocide, like economic uncertainty or conflict of various kinds, and so on. And I think when you look at that, and at the scholarship that's being done on that and the specific proposals that have been put forward in the context of the responsibility to protect, for example, which is talking about how states can build resilient societies and plural societies and those that are not riven by ethnic capture of the institutions and these very toxic and dangerous elements, then we will never know if we prevented genocide, ideally, because we won't get close to that point. And I think a lot can be done and is being done at that level, most of all by the populations in the affected societies at the grassroots in terms of peace building initiatives and reconciliation and truth seeking processes and so on, to fortify that resilience. Another thing that I think we can do, what's the old Hippocratic oath? First, do no
Extra
harm,
harm, yeah.
right? And that is true in a firefighter intervention situation, yes, but it's also true when it comes to societies that are fragile or are riven or are unstable. Are we imposing policies or expectations or rulers that are making things worse and are driving them closer to a breaking point? And those could be ruinous debt obligations, or they could be tacitly accepting a military coup or something along those lines that just becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. And the responsibilities of the outside world, and I think the irresponsibility of certain key actors and international institutions in not only making these social structures more fire resistant, but actually pouring gasoline on the fire. That doesn't help. And that's something that we, in the more privileged and therefore more likely to be powerful societies, can have a place and a role and something to contribute and make sure that we're not making things worse.
I think that's quite interesting that you end with this, and I think there's certainly something serious. There's nothing, I don't think there's anything pie in the sky about pointing out that the reactive model, let's stop the killing once 500,000 are already dead, has its limits. And in a way, it dovetails with something McIntyre wrote years ago in a book review where he was talking about all these so-called dilemmas about war with a book that was perhaps in some ways unremarkable. And one of the points he made was that if we want to avoid some of these situations of really terrible war dilemmas, we might have to start fighting more wars early on to prevent things getting as catastrophic as they were, right? This is the classic argument, they should have gone into the Ruhr in the early 30s, and that would have avoided 70 million death. You might have had 2 million. It's a pretty good
Czechoslovakia,
trade-off.
man, could have all been settled in 1938, but don't get me started.
So, well, that'll have to be another talk. But look, Adam Jones, it has been a genuine pleasure. I'm sure you've given a great deal for our students and other not so formally registered students to think about and to discuss with those around them who care about the world. So thank you very much, and I bid you a good evening.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Renaud, and for your probing questions and thoughtful comments.